Good morning. My name's Ian. I have the immense privilege of being the minister in Crawley Baptist Church. That's just one of many churches represented here this morning. I think this is my 33rd Good Friday service in Queen Square in Crawley. And I know I don't look old enough, but it's true. One of the thieves on the cross said, "If you are the Messiah, why don't you save yourself and us?" The last 2 or 3 years, I think you would agree, has seen immense suffering. 2020 started in our house looking forward to a wedding, which was due to be on the 27th of June. Usually those are a big family occasion, and all our family were coming, even the ones that live the other side of the pond, who rarely get to come to this country. By the beginning of May, our hopes were slightly let down. By the beginning of June, we knew the family weren't coming, and we knew the wedding wasn't happening. That was a double trauma. Family we hadn't seen, and a wedding that would not take place. On the 19th of June, my mother, who up until that point had enjoyed a good health, had a heart attack and was taken to Bournemouth Hospital. We postponed the wedding by a week because I'm a minister and we can do that kind of thing. In the 2 weeks before that wedding, I and my brother and my sister were travelling from Crawley and London and Worcester to visit my mother. And of course, you remember back to the first lockdown, you were allowed 1 hour by one person a day to visit a loved one in a hospital. So we were sharing visits, 2 hours, 3 hours, 3.5 hour drives. My mum died in Bournemouth Hospital on the 1st of July 2020. Her husband, my father, died on the 1st of July 1970. My mother died 50 years to the day of her husband, my dad. 3 days after my mum died, we celebrated the wedding of my daughter, but not with the 200 people we planned, just 20 of us in a church and 15 of us in the back garden. A week after my mother died, one of my colleagues at church, Andrew, who had been our operations manager, died after being ill with cancer. We knew it was coming, but it's always a shock. A week after the funeral of my mother, I took the funeral of my colleague in Crawley Baptist Church. In January 2021, I contracted COVID, collapsed in the bathroom, and went to East Surrey Hospital in an ambulance. I was cared for the people who I'd been praying with on the emergency department teams at the beginning of their shift. In March 2021, one of my colleagues' husbands stood up at home, his heart gave out, and he died instantly. In June 2021, my father-in-law, who lived in Southern California, was coming to the end of his life. He'd been ill with cancer, but we knew it was the last time that we would get to go and see him. I could tell you a very long story, and if you want to know, which I don't recommend you do, how difficult it was to get paperwork together to travel to America in a lockdown. We went knowing that would be the last time we would see him alive. It was hard for me, it was much harder for my wife, and especially when we drove away from his house at the end of that week with him leaning on his car, waving to us, knowing that that would be the last time we would see him alive. As a family, we sat on our house in Crawley in September, watching his funeral service on Zoom, because it was too hard to get there again. There are people whose suffering is far harder than mine, and you may be one of them. I worked part-time as a chaplain at East Surrey Hospital, and during lockdown, I was visiting people whose loved ones were in hospital and they couldn't visit them. I was phoning them regularly, I still do it. I phone families every week who lost loved ones in hospital. And the stories I heard were traumatic. And I am still hearing traumatic stories, and it may be that you are one of those families. I work as a counsellor at St Catherine's Hospice, and every week I talk to people whose loved ones have died or are dying, or people who are themselves dying, and I hear traumatic stories of people and their suffering. Many, many people in the world today suffer. My suffering does not compare with theirs. Those who suffer from war, natural disasters, the refugees, the asylum seekers, those who have been abused and are still being abused, those who are lonely and abandoned, and I could go on, and maybe you are one of them. A question sometimes people ask is simply this: if there is a God, why is there suffering? Here's a question that's worth pondering. If you take God away, you are still left with suffering, but no God. A thief on a cross says to Jesus, if you are the Messiah, why don't you come down and save yourself and us? Jesus chose the road of suffering. Jesus chose to walk to a cross. Jesus knows what suffering is, and he knows what it's all about because he himself suffered. The truth about the cross of Easter is that God is not distant, unaware, and uninterested in our suffering. He is the God who comes to us in our suffering, the God who chose to embrace suffering and not to avoid it. He took our pain and bore our suffering, and by his wounds we are healed. The truth about Easter and the cross of Easter is that on that cross, Jesus transformed suffering into the means by which God saves people like you and me. The truth about Easter and the cross of Easter is that it brings hope into your suffering and mine. All suffering is hard, but the cross speaks hope into our suffering. For here, God meets us, God holds us, God keeps us, and God protects us. It is in the suffering of Jesus on the cross that we find hope. The God who comes to us in our suffering with his transforming love. And if you are suffering today, God comes to you in your suffering to bring you hope. Amen.